John Maynard Keynes, who wrote a book in 1936 that laid the foundations for Keynesian stimulus, stabilization by the government, which has remained controversial ever since. There was a lot of subtlety in his book, but it just didn't fit into the paradigm of thinking of that day. And he wrote it in 1936. 1 year later, Sir John Hicks wrote an article called Keynes and the Classics and Interpretation that reinterpreted Keynes and put it into mathematical framework and curve shifting. Economists like to shift. You've studied economics? You have supply and you demand. You shift the supply curve or the demand curve, and I've discovered that there's a bias toward that kind of economics. But the problem that Keynes was getting at, and I think that we're trying to get at too, is that these problems are not so clear-cut. They involve issues that economists are uncomfortable with, like psychology. So Keynes, writing in 1936, used the word once in his book, animal spirits, that ultimately he thought the economy is driven by some kind of changing psychology. Animal spirits means your animating spirit, what makes you get up out of bed every morning and ready to face the day. It's a psychological thing. And I think our understanding of human nature is getting much more complex now. We have a whole new field called behavioral economics that's informed by psychology, and now by neuroscience and computer analogies. Our whole view of human nature is changing, and economics has to change with it. So I think that Keynes was a creative thinker who was ahead of his time. He wrote things that inspired people, but it didn't connect for them. And we tried to make a connection. We are, again, looking at the foundations of economics and trying to correct possible misinterpretations. Economic theory is actually very important because we tend to fall back on the theory in ambiguous situations. There's also something called theory-induced blindness. Scientists are supposed to be on the lookout all the time for disconfirming evidence for the prevailing theory. Human nature is that we're not very good at that. We tend not to see the evidence against our theory until someone lays it out. So we think there was something of a revolution in economics about a half century ago. It had a political ramification too. This is free markets, a greater respect for free markets and disrespect for regulation. So we call it the Thatcher-Reagan revolution. And this is the idea of the perfection of free markets, that they should be completely left alone because the freer they are, the more perfect they are. That idea is attributed to the Scottish economist, philosopher Adam Smith. You've heard of him, who wrote in 1776. His most famous phrase is, "It is not to the benevolence that I get my dinner from the butcher, the baker, or the brewer. It's from my appeal to their self-interest." So he talked about a world in which you have philanthropists and do-gooders who are basically worthless. They don't do anything. It's the butcher, the baker, and the brewer who are doing something that people will pay them for that matter most in our society. That's become a caricature of Adam Smith. As a matter of fact, he didn't believe that fully either. That was one moment in his writings. He wrote another book in 1759 called The Theory of Moral Sentiments. He said, people are not completely selfish. There is an altruistic element in human nature. So what we are talking about is about a human tendency for manipulation and deception. We're not negative about people. We agree with Adam Smith that people are helpful and they want to be a contributor to society. But on the other hand, they can get sneaky a little bit. The research of Dan Ariely, who's a professor of economics at Duke University, he did a lot of things to test whether people are completely honest. And he did experiments in which people were given reason to believe that they could cheat and nobody could ever possibly know. And his conclusion was, people do value their integrity. They can't resist the temptation. One experiment he did is he put 6 bottles of Coca-Cola in a communal refrigerator and $6 bills. And then he came back 2 weeks later and found that all the Cokes were gone, but the $6 bills were completely untouched. So what he concluded, people think, well, maybe it's okay. I have deniability. I grabbed that Coke. I thought it was mine, you know. But they're not going to take somebody's money, right? So that was all still there. So that's the kind of world we live in. And we wanted to think about what that means for economics. In a modern free market economy, organizations develop built around human weaknesses. And that we call phishing. Phishing with a PH. It's a new word, and it refers to a certain kind of internet fraud. But we wanted to use it more generally as a metaphor for any kind of manipulation and deception. And we also, it should say phishing for fools, the economics of manipulation and deception. Fool is spelled with a PH. That refers to most of us present, I suppose. It doesn't mean a fool with an F. It means somebody who hasn't appreciated the magnitude of the phishing that's going on. You don't know your own brain bugs, but professionals do. And you lead a life of an illusion of self-direction when you're in fact being directed by others. Professional organizations thrive on little quirks in your ability to repel manipulation. Harmless often, but there was a book in 1957 by Vance Packard. They used to advertise cigarettes in those days. Experiment with smokers to see if they could tell their own brand apart from other brands. And the conclusion was, nobody can tell. But why is there all this brand loyalty? Well, it turns out marketers have created that. What matters to people very much isn't how the cigarette tastes. They don't really care. They all taste pretty much the same anyway. What they care about is what it says about me. Cigarette advertisers use an experimental approach. This is a 20th century thing. Experimental approach to defining an ad. So Marlboro cigarettes invented the Marlboro man. But the way they did it was with experimentation. They tried many different figures. And one of them was a cowboy, tough-looking, rugged guy. And for some reason, that ad worked. You've probably heard it. There's a consumerist movement that warns people against being seduced by ads like this. But we think that there's something more fundamental that has not entered economic theory. So if I can be a little bit academic, we're academic here, right? People who take courses in economics, either at the undergraduate level or at the PhD level, are generally taught something called the fundamental theorem of welfare economics. So what is that theorem? Well, this is a construct that economists lay at the core of economic theory. The idea is that each person has a concept of his or her own utility. There's a utility function that has arguments in the amount that you consume of various products. And the outcome, the dependent variable, is utility. What is utility? Well, they would refer back to the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, who did a very practical version of ethics. He said, ultimately, the only thing that matters is human happiness. But he called it utility. There was some phishing going on here. There was some marketing. Economists love this term. Happiness has a sound of maybe frivolous happiness. Utility means useful, good. And the fundamental theorem of welfare economics says that in a free market competitive equilibrium with no externalities, the resulting equilibrium is Pareto optimal. Now, Vilfredo Pareto was a Swiss-Italian economist writing around 1900 who actually anticipated the whole fundamental theorem. He was trying to say what's good about free markets in the abstract. And he wrote down this idea, Pareto optimal, the free market equilibrium. It's impossible to make anybody better off by reallocating consumption goods without making someone worse off. There's no way to make everybody better off. At that time, Pareto said this should be the objective of an economist. We don't talk about taking money from one person like Robin Hood and giving it to another. It's all about making everybody better off, and we should confine our attention to that. If that's what you take and you believe the fundamental theorem of welfare economics, then the job is done. All we have to do is campaign against tariffs, taxes, regulations, anything that interferes with free markets. It works on the assumption that everyone knows their own utility. The problem with that is that people don't know their utility. And in fact, what is this utility? The first person to criticize Pareto optimality was Vilfredo Pareto himself. He said, I was only kidding when I wrote that. Well, that's not a quote. But he became a sociologist later in life. And he thought that human society is much more complicated than he suggested. In 1918, Irving Fisher, a professor at Yale University, wrote an article in the American Economic Review, which is our publication. The article said, I think they should change the word. They can present this theory, but we shouldn't call it utility. And he hunted around for what is the right word. Maybe we should say happiness. But then he said, I think the right word is wantability. He coined that word. Wantability means something you think will make you happier, but maybe it won't. That's such a unique word that was invented by one man, Irving Fisher. So I can track its use through history. For the next 20 or 30 years, it was used frequently. And then it tailed off exponentially after, say, 1950. And then when Margaret Thatcher became prime minister, it hit zero. And the word is completely forgotten now. And the economists I've asked, they've never heard of it. I'll give you one other example, and then that we talk about, and it's the slot machine. The slot machine, the gambling machine, was invented in the 1890s. And it soon became apparent that it's addictive. Most people aren't addicted by it, but be careful playing that machine. You might be one who is addicted. And it ruins their life. They just want to play it constantly. What it seems to be is there's some kind of loop in the brain that when you pull the lever, or now it's press the button, you get a thrill of anticipation. Maybe I won. Now neuroscientists will tell you that the brainstem, the reward mechanism, are sending out a reward signal, even though you haven't won. And then that signal fades, and so then you want to pull the lever again. Some people, there's something missing in their brain saying, you got to stop. This is not going to stay here all day. But those machines are now growing as a percent of gambling revenue. Gambling used to be, let's have some friends over for a game of poker. It was social. But now you have gambling casinos with slot machines. They now have learned through science of gambling that people are a little bit ashamed to be seen with the slot machine. So they try to arrange them so you can find an off-the-way place to do your gambling where no one will see you. And they also make sure the optimal time between gambles is 3.5 seconds. If they slow you down, so you're not pressing the button every 3.5 seconds, you might stop. So it used to be that when you won, you have to win occasionally, coins would come pouring out. And then, but you have to do something with these coins, right? You have to scoop them up and put them somewhere. And that breaks the 3.5 second rule. And a lot of people will stop at that point. So now what they've figured out, they have a computer simulation of the sound of coins tinkling. Are they doing this in your interest? Absolutely not. It's profit-centered. And the problem with a fishing equilibrium, you might say, I wouldn't do that. But there will always be somebody else, as long as there's a profit incentive. Moreover, they will put these slot machines wherever they can, because each one of them works. But even in Las Vegas, regulators are there. Somebody recently aired a proposal to the Nevada Gaming Commission that we should create gambling opportunities at cash registers of convenience stores so that when people get their change back, they can gamble their change. And even Nevada thought that wasn't okay. That some of these things are very important. Gambling, by the way, is an addiction which causes marriages to break up, families to be distressed, people to go into poverty. It has a real cost. There's a tendency for people to spend too much. In the US, 1% of households declare bankruptcy every year. They're ashamed, so you don't hear about it. But it's alcohol. They still advertise that. It's partly because there's a view that a glass of wine a day is good for you. I can just tell you this. There are medical articles questioning whether that glass of wine is really good for you. But I'm just still troubled by the ads that we see for alcohol, given that they show happy young people drinking together on TV, 30 seconds, the most beautiful people you'd like to be. I think it's creating an atmosphere where it's hard not to drink. We've seen it modeled so many times on TV. And in fact, alcohol is a serious problem in our society, not just because of death due to alcohol, which is a substantial cause of death, but in the way it damages human relationships and marriages, particularly when one member of a couple is an alcoholic. But we have to realize that fishing plays a role. But I want to just conclude with some optimism. And actually, it's more than optimism. It's about why our society works as well as it does. There's a tendency in modern US, UK, and other countries to think that our success is exclusively explained by our commitment to individual freedom and free markets. Well, I think that's a half-truth. It's partly explained by that. But it's also explained, I think, by our sense of civil society. What makes a nation successful? This is subtle, but I think the UK and the US are both well along on civil society. By the way, I have a habit of calling the UK our mother country. I don't know why. There's some resistance to saying that. But there's something about the culture here, which is a civil society culture where people get together in places like this and talk. They view the government as their servant. They're ready to vote the guy out the minute they don't like him or her. They are opinionated. They have a sense that nobody else is taking care of this problem. I will. RSA is nonprofit, right? That's another example right there. And these things are then spurred by individuals who are not necessarily doing it as part of their job. It's out of personal sense of integrity. So what I've been doing in the United States, I give some examples of heroes. People who led social movements. I called out to my audience, what do you think of these people who I think are really our heroes? Almost nobody had heard of any of these people. So we remember as heroes novelists, singers, actresses, all these useless people generally, and the people who really changed our lives. So I'll try out one American example. Alice Lakey. Good, that's what I expect. No one can tell who she is. Or Harvey Washington Wiley. Okay, well, you're excused because those are Americans. But I found their British counterparts. Okay. Otto Hainer. Okay, now, am I being offensive here and asking? Or Charles Casal. Those were the people that brought in the food and drug regulation at around 1900. Well, I'm a little embarrassed to say this. There's something called American exceptionalism. Americans are given history in school that they have one lesson on world history. And the one lesson says there used to be kings and feudal wars, and they were all fighting each other. And then America was born. And then it was freedom and democracy. And so we don't know anything. The embarrassment is that we didn't talk about Otto Hainer. We talked about our American heroes who, in the beginning of the 20th century, pointed out through experimentation and argumentation that most medicines that were offered in drugstores were frauds. They analyzed what was in the ingredients of these medicines. It would say, Dr. Swaim's panacea, and it claims it would cure everything. So we look, what's in it? Sugar, artificial coloring, and then maybe some herb that had never been studied. But even that, the herb wasn't consistent. They would get another sample, and it wasn't there in the other sample. They had substituted something else. And yet, it took someone campaigning against it. So in 1906, the US Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act, created the Food and Drug Administration that tests drugs for safety. And the embarrassment is that I discovered the UK did the same act in 1899. It was 7 years before us. So I have another book to recommend, which is especially important that Americans read it, but you could read it too. 20 years ago, the book was called Atlantic Crossing by Professor Rogers at Princeton. The book argues that ideas were going back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean between America and Europe for hundreds of years, but he concentrates on a century of great progress from mid-19th to the mid-20th century. In the United States, no politician would say, I'm proposing the Food and Drug Administration. We're copying what the Brits did 7 years ago. But nonetheless, Harvey Washington Wiley and Alice Lakey are still heroes for promoting a new idea. And it's an idea about government intervention with market solutions. The government intervention should not be considered evil, as it so often, the theory that's prevalent these days marks these things as evil, and it underestimates the importance of civil society. It's not all of us just deciding what we will buy and withdrawing our purchases from the producers we don't like. It's getting up and talking and complaining. And it's not just the government, it's nonprofits, it's organization, and it's business as well, business societies. All of these make for a successful economy, and I'll stop with that.